Daniel Carter had attended weddings before, but he had never felt as alone at one as he did that Saturday afternoon. He sat at a round table near the back of a beautiful country house wedding venue, wearing his best navy suit. It was not expensive, but it was clean, pressed, and carefully chosen. Daniel was 38 and a single father to his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. He had come to the wedding because the bride, Sophie, was an old friend from university. He wanted to be there for her, even if he knew almost nobody else. The reception was filled with successful people. There were business owners, lawyers, property developers, and wealthy families. Daniel felt completely out of place. His old estate car was parked between two expensive luxury cars outside. His suit probably cost less than some guests had spent on their shoes. But Daniel wasn't embarrassed. He had spent years learning that appearances did not pay bills. Being a good father did. Lily was staying with Daniel's sister for the afternoon. Before leaving home, she had hugged him and said, "Dad, don't sit by yourself." Daniel had laughed. "I'll be fine." Now he looked at the empty chair beside him. "Well, Lily," he whispered, "you were right." He smiled to himself. A waiter offered him champagne. Daniel politely declined. "Sparkling water, please." He wasn't interested in pretending to be someone he wasn't. Around him, guests talked and laughed. The bride and groom were greeting everyone. Daniel watched Sophie, smiling across the room. He was genuinely happy for her. Then the room suddenly became quieter. Daniel looked toward the entrance. An older woman had just walked inside. She was elegant, confident, and completely composed. Her silver hair was perfectly styled. She wore a cream-colored designer suit. She didn't need an introduction. Almost everyone knew her. Margaret Whitmore, a billionaire businesswoman who had built one of Britain's largest private companies. Daniel had seen her photograph in newspapers. He never expected to meet her. Margaret greeted the bride warmly. Then something strange happened. She looked across the room. Her eyes stopped on Daniel. Daniel glanced behind himself. Nobody was sitting there. He looked back. Margaret was still staring directly at him. Then she started walking towards his table. Daniel sat up. People began noticing. Whispers traveled across the room. Why was Margaret Whitmore walking towards a lonely man sitting at the back? Margaret stopped beside Daniel. "Daniel Carter?" He stood. "Yes." She smiled. "I'm Margaret Whitmore." "I know." She offered her hand. Daniel shook it. Her expression became surprisingly warm. "May I sit?" Daniel looked at the empty chair. "Of course." Margaret sat opposite him. Daniel was confused. "Have we met before?" "No." "Then why me?" Margaret looked at him for several seconds. "Because I knew your father." Daniel's expression changed immediately. "My father?" Margaret nodded. "Thomas Carter." Daniel slowly sat back down. His father had died nearly 20 years earlier. He had never heard Margaret Whitmore mention him. "My father worked for your company." "He did." "He was just an accountant." Margaret smiled sadly. That's what he wanted people to believe. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret reached into her jacket and removed an old photograph. She placed it on the table. Daniel picked it up. His father was standing beside Margaret in front of an office building. Daniel had never seen the photograph. "When was this?" 20 years ago." Daniel looked at her. "Why are you showing me this?" Margaret's voice became quieter. "Because your father saved my company." Daniel stared at her. "What?" "He discovered financial fraud inside the business." Daniel's eyes widened. "Was anyone arrested?" Margaret shook her head. "No." "Why?" "Because your father disappeared from the investigation before he could expose the person responsible." Daniel looked uncomfortable. "My father didn't disappear." Margaret paused. "You're right." She looked down. He was pushed out. Daniel's jaw tightened. "By whom?" Margaret looked across the room. Her eyes landed on a tall man wearing a gray suit. Daniel followed her gaze. The man was laughing with several guests. "Who is that?" "Richard Hale." Daniel waited. Margaret continued. "He was one of the most trusted executives in my company." Daniel looked back at her. "Was?" Margaret nodded. "Until I discovered what he had done." Daniel stared at Richard. Then Margaret said something that made his stomach tighten. Your father suspected him. Daniel whispered. Suspected? He had evidence. What happened to it? Margaret looked directly at Daniel. That is why I came to you. Daniel didn't understand. Margaret leaned closer. Your father left something behind. Daniel remembered the old envelope. It had been in his father's belongings for years. Daniel had never opened it. He had always assumed it contained personal documents. He reached inside his jacket. Margaret's eyes immediately focused on it. You still have it. Daniel froze. You knew about this? Your father told me. Daniel placed the envelope on the table. What's inside? I don't know. Daniel looked surprised. You don't know? Margaret shook her head. Your father wouldn't tell me. Why? He said that only his son should open it. Daniel stared at the envelope. His father's handwriting was still visible across the front. His hands became slightly unsteady. Then he remembered his father's final birthday gift. His father had handed him the envelope and said, One day you'll understand. Daniel had been 19. He had never understood. Until now. He carefully opened it. Inside was a small black key and a handwritten note. Daniel unfolded the note. Only one sentence was written. The key opens what they never found. Daniel looked at Margaret. What does it open? Before Margaret could answer, someone approached their table. It was Richard Hale. He smiled politely. Daniel looked up. Have we met? No. Richard extended his hand. Richard Hale. Daniel didn't shake it. Richard's smile became slightly uncomfortable. I knew your father. Daniel immediately noticed Margaret's expression. She looked tense. Richard glanced at the envelope, then at the key. For the first time, his confident expression disappeared. You should be careful with old family belongings, Richard said. Daniel stared at him. Why? Richard gave a small smile. Some things are better forgotten. Then he walked away. Daniel watched him. Margaret leaned forward. Now you understand why I needed to speak to you. Daniel looked at the key. What does he know? Enough to be afraid. Daniel looked towards Richard. The man was pretending to enjoy the wedding, but he kept looking back at their table. Daniel suddenly realized something. He had arrived at the wedding thinking he was just a guest. Now he was holding a secret that had survived for 20 years. Margaret stood. We need to talk somewhere private. Daniel shook his head. My daughter is waiting for me. Margaret smiled. Then we won't take long. Daniel looked at her. Tell me the truth. Margaret nodded. The key opens a room beneath your father's old office. Daniel froze. I thought that building was demolished. It was. Then how can a room still exist? Margaret gave him a serious look. Because your father knew the building would be demolished. Daniel's eyes widened. He planned for it. Yes. Why? Margaret looked towards Richard. Because he knew someone was trying to destroy the evidence. Daniel closed his hand around the key. For the first time that afternoon, he understood why his father had kept so many secrets. And he also understood something else. Richard Hale hadn't been surprised to see Daniel. He had been afraid. The single dad who had arrived at the wedding feeling invisible was suddenly at the center of a 20-year-old mystery. But neither Daniel nor Margaret knew the biggest twist yet. The evidence inside that hidden room wasn't simply about corporate fraud. It contained a document proving that Daniel's father had been protecting someone connected directly to the wedding. And when Daniel finally discovered who that person was, he would realize his father had sacrificed his entire career for one reason, to protect his son. Daniel couldn't stop staring at the black key in his hand. The wedding reception continued around him. People laughed. Waiters carried plates across the room. Music played softly. But Daniel barely noticed any of it. He kept thinking about his father. For 20 years, he had believed Thomas Carter had lived an ordinary life. Now, he was discovering that the man had been involved in something much bigger. Margaret sat opposite him. Daniel, there's something you need to understand. Daniel looked up. What? Your father wasn't trying to become rich. I know. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Then what was he trying to do? Margaret looked towards Richard Hale. Protect people. Daniel followed her gaze. Richard was talking to another guest, but he looked uncomfortable now. Margaret continued. Your father discovered that money was being moved from several Whitmore Group companies into accounts controlled by people connected to senior executives. Daniel frowned. And Richard was involved? We believe so. We? Margaret nodded. I couldn't prove it at the time. Why not? Because every piece of evidence disappeared. Daniel looked at the key. Except this. Except what your father protected. Daniel carefully placed the key back into his pocket. I need to see that room. Margaret nodded. We can go after the wedding. Daniel shook his head. Not after. Margaret looked at him. Why? Because Richard already knows. Margaret was silent. Daniel continued. If he knows about the key, waiting gives him time to do something. For the first time, Margaret smiled. You think like your father. Daniel didn't know whether that was a compliment. Before they could continue, Sophie approached their table. Daniel, she hugged him. I'm so glad you're here. Daniel smiled. Congratulations. Sophie looked at Margaret. I see you've met. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You knew she was coming? Sophie laughed nervously. Of course. Daniel noticed the nervousness. You knew my father too? Sophie hesitated. Not personally. Margaret looked at Sophie. Not quite. Daniel noticed the exchange. What aren't you telling me? Sophie glanced around. Not here. Daniel's expression became serious. Everyone seems to know something except me. Sophie touched his arm. I wanted you to have a normal afternoon. Daniel gave a small laugh. That didn't work. Sophie smiled. No. She leaned closer. There's a reason I invited you. Daniel looked confused. I thought you wanted an old friend at your wedding. I did, but... Sophie looked towards Margaret. Margaret gave a slight nod. Sophie took a breath. Your father helped my family, too. Daniel stared at her. How? My father nearly lost everything 20 years ago. Daniel said nothing. Your father found something that protected our family. Daniel suddenly understood. The fraud investigation. Sophie nodded. But there was more. She looked uncomfortable. My father knew who was behind it. Daniel asked, Who? Sophie looked towards Richard. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Richard Hale? Sophie shook her head. No. That surprised him. Then who? Sophie lowered her voice. Someone you would never expect. Before she could say more, a waiter approached. Miss Bennett, your mother needs you. Sophie nodded. I'll come back. She walked away. Daniel looked at Margaret. What was that about? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then she said, Your father was investigating more than financial fraud. What else? Identity. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Margaret looked around. Some of the people involved were using false identities. Daniel's expression changed. Why? To move money without anyone connecting them. Daniel leaned back. That's serious. Very. And my father found them? He found one. Who? Margaret shook her head. He never wrote the name down. Why? Because he believed someone inside the company was reading his files. Daniel looked at the key again. So the room contains a name. Possibly. Then let's go. Margaret stood. Daniel followed. They left the reception area through a side door. The afternoon sun was bright over the gardens. Guests were outside taking photographs. Nobody paid much attention to Daniel and Margaret walking toward the car park, except Richard. He watched them leave. Then he quietly took out his phone. Daniel and Margaret drove to the old Whitmore Group property. The building had changed dramatically. The main offices were gone. A modern development stood in their place. But Margaret knew exactly where the old basement had been. They stopped beside a small brick structure that had been preserved during construction. Daniel looked at it. This is it. Margaret nodded. Your father used to work here. They entered. Inside was a narrow corridor. Margaret walked to the far wall. She moved an old metal panel. Behind it was a small keyhole. Daniel took out the black key. It fit perfectly. He turned it. A heavy click echoed through the corridor. A section of the wall moved. Daniel stared. Behind it was a narrow staircase. Margaret looked at him. Your father built this. Daniel slowly descended. The room below was surprisingly clean. There were shelves, old filing boxes, a wooden desk, and a locked metal cabinet. Daniel walked toward the desk. There was an old photograph sitting on it. It showed his father with a young Daniel. Daniel picked it up. On the back was another message. Everything I did was for you. Daniel's eyes became wet. For years, he had wondered why his father had become distant near the end of his life. Now he understood. His father had been carrying a secret. Daniel opened the metal cabinet. Inside were documents, bank statements, company records, photographs, letters, and a small cassette recorder. Margaret stared at it. Your father kept a recording. Daniel picked it up. There was a handwritten label. Thomas Carter, final statement. Daniel pressed play. His father's voice filled the room. If you're hearing this, I didn't get the chance to finish what I started. Daniel froze. It was unmistakably his father. Thomas continued. Margaret, if you are listening, I'm sorry. Margaret closed her eyes. Daniel listened carefully. I discovered that the person behind the missing money isn't working alone. The recording crackled. They have help from someone outside the company. Daniel looked at Margaret. His father's voice continued. And that person has access to my family. Daniel's face changed. Family? Margaret looked at him. Thomas continued. I couldn't risk Daniel being used against me. Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. Then the recording revealed something unexpected. The person I trusted most is the one I fear most. The tape ended. Silence filled the room. Daniel stared at the recorder. Who was he talking about? Margaret looked at the documents. We need to find out. Daniel picked up the first folder. Inside were several photographs. One showed Richard Hale. Another showed a woman Daniel didn't recognize. The third photograph made him freeze. It showed Sophie Bennett's father. Daniel looked at Margaret. Why is Sophie's father here? Margaret took the photograph. Her expression changed completely. This changes everything. Daniel looked closer. Behind the three men stood another person, a woman. Daniel recognized her. It was Lily's school head teacher. Daniel's eyes widened. What is she doing here? Margaret looked at him. I don't know. Daniel suddenly felt uneasy. The head teacher had always been kind to Lily. She had attended school meetings. She knew Daniel's family. She knew where Lily lived. Daniel's stomach tightened. Could she be involved? Margaret shook her head. Don't jump to conclusions. Daniel looked at the photograph. Then why is she standing with them? Before Margaret could answer, they heard footsteps above. Both froze. Someone was inside the building. Daniel quickly switched off the recorder. Margaret whispered, Did anyone follow us? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. The footsteps became louder. Then a man's voice came from the corridor. Margaret. Daniel recognized it immediately. Richard Hale. Margaret's face became serious. How did he find us? Daniel looked at the hidden staircase. He followed us. Richard appeared at the doorway. He looked at the documents. Then at Daniel. Your father was always stubborn. Daniel stepped forward. What happened to him? Richard didn't answer. Daniel's voice became stronger. I asked you what happened to my father. Richard stared at him. Then he said something Daniel never expected. Your father wasn't betrayed by me. Daniel froze. Margaret stepped forward. Don't listen to him. Richard looked at her. You still believe I was responsible? You were. Richard shook his head. No. He looked at Daniel. I tried to protect him. Daniel stared. From whom? Richard's expression became grim. From your own family. Daniel felt his stomach drop. My family? Richard nodded. Your father discovered that someone close to him was feeding information to the people stealing the money. Who? Richard looked directly at Daniel. Then he said, Your mother? Daniel's face went pale. His mother had died when he was a child. He barely remembered her. Richard continued, Your father knew she was being threatened. Daniel shook his head. No, she wasn't a criminal. Then why did he blame her? He didn't. Richard reached into his jacket. He pulled out an old letter. Read this. Daniel took it. The handwriting was his mother's. The first sentence made his hands tremble. Thomas, if anything happens to me, keep Daniel away from the Whitmore family. Daniel looked up. Richard was watching him. Margaret looked stunned. Daniel slowly read the rest. The letter revealed that Daniel's mother had discovered the same financial network years before Thomas did. She had tried to expose it, but someone had threatened her. Daniel looked at Margaret. Why didn't you know this? Margaret's voice was quiet. Because I never saw that letter. Richard said, Thomas hid it. Daniel looked down. There was one final line. The person you trust most is not who you think. Daniel stared at it. His father, his mother, Margaret, Richard. Someone had been lying for 20 years. Then Daniel noticed something else. A date on the letter. It was dated 3 days before his mother's death. Daniel's voice shook. My mother didn't die naturally. Margaret looked at him. Richard said nothing. Daniel turned towards him. What happened to her? Richard's expression became serious. That's the question your father spent the rest of his life trying to answer. Daniel felt his entire understanding of his family collapsing. Then his phone rang. It was his sister Emma. Daniel answered immediately. Emma? Her voice was frightened. Daniel, where are you? I'm with Margaret. Daniel, you need to come home. Why? Emma took a breath. Lily just received a letter. Daniel's heart stopped. What letter? Emma said, it has your father's handwriting on it. Daniel looked at Margaret, then at Richard. Nobody spoke, because the message had arrived 20 years after Thomas Carter's death, and it contained only one sentence. If they ever come looking for my granddaughter, don't let her go. Daniel immediately turned towards the door. The mystery was no longer about the past. It was about Lily. And someone had just reminded Daniel that the secret his father had protected for 20 years was still alive. Daniel drove back toward home as quickly as he safely could. Margaret sat beside him. Richard had stayed behind. The wedding was forgotten now. Daniel could think about only one thing. Lily, his daughter. The message had terrified him. Someone had sent a letter using his father's handwriting. Someone knew about Lily. Someone wanted Daniel to believe she was in danger. Margaret looked at him. Daniel, slow down. I need to get home. We will. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel. How can anyone know about that old message? Margaret didn't answer, because she was thinking the same thing. Someone had access to Thomas Carter's records. Someone who had been waiting for Daniel to find them. When Daniel arrived home, Emma was standing outside. She looked worried. Daniel got out immediately. Where's Lily? Inside. He rushed through the front door. Lily ran towards him. Dad. Daniel dropped to his knees and hugged her tightly. I'm here. Lily looked confused. What's wrong? Nothing. Daniel kissed the top of her head. You scared me. I didn't do anything. I know. Lily looked at Margaret. Who is she? Margaret smiled. I'm an old friend of your grandfather. Lily's eyes widened. You knew Granddad? Yes. Was he nice? Margaret smiled. He was one of the kindest men I ever knew. Lily smiled. Daniel stood. Emma handed him the letter. It arrived about an hour ago. Daniel opened it carefully. It was the same message. But there was something else. A second page was attached. Daniel read it. The key is only the beginning. Below that was an address. Daniel recognized it immediately. It was the address of an old railway station outside town. Margaret looked over his shoulder. That's where your father used to meet me. Daniel looked at her. Why would someone send us there? Because they want us to find something. Emma looked worried. Should you go? Daniel thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. Margaret looked surprised. Daniel folded the letter. We don't play by their rules. He took out his phone. I'm going to contact the police. Margaret nodded. Good. Daniel looked at the old photograph again. Then he noticed something. The address wasn't handwritten. It had been typed. But the final sentence was written by hand. Daniel recognized the handwriting. It wasn't his father's. It wasn't his mother's. It belonged to someone else. Someone Daniel had seen that afternoon. He looked at Margaret. The person who sent this was at the wedding. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. I recognized the handwriting. Whose? Daniel didn't answer. He grabbed his coat. We need to go back. Margaret followed. Daniel, wait. He stopped. We need to know who you're thinking about. Daniel looked at her. The head teacher. Margaret's expression changed. You believe she sent the letter? I don't know. But she was in the photograph with my father. Margaret nodded slowly. Then we need to find out why. They returned to the wedding venue. The afternoon celebration was still underway. Guests were outside enjoying the sunshine. Music played across the garden. Nobody realized that Daniel had returned for a completely different reason. The head teacher, Mrs. Collins, was standing near the entrance. When she saw Daniel, her expression changed. Daniel walked towards her. Mrs. Collins. She smiled nervously. Daniel, I need to ask you something. Of course. Did you know my father? She paused. Only by reputation. Daniel watched her carefully. That's not what I asked. She looked uncomfortable. Margaret stepped beside Daniel. Mrs. Collins looked at Margaret. I think you should speak privately. Daniel nodded. They entered a quiet sitting room. Mrs. Collins closed the door. I knew your father. Daniel said nothing. How? He helped my family. With what? She looked down. My father worked for Whitmore Group. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Another connection. She nodded. Your father discovered something that could have destroyed several families. Financial fraud? Yes. Daniel asked, Did you know Richard Hale? Mrs. Collins looked up. Yes. Was he involved? She hesitated. Not in the way you think. Daniel was becoming frustrated. Everyone keeps saying that. Mrs. Collins took a breath. Richard was investigating the same people your father was investigating. Margaret frowned. That's impossible. Mrs. Collins looked at her. Not impossible. She reached into her handbag. She removed an old photograph. Daniel stared. It showed Richard Hale meeting Thomas Carter. But the date was only a few months before Thomas died. Daniel looked at Margaret. Why didn't you know about this? Margaret shook her head. I didn't. Mrs. Collins continued. Your father trusted Richard. Daniel stared at the photograph. So, why did Richard accuse my mother? Mrs. Collins became silent. Because he needed someone to blame. Daniel's expression changed. Who? Mrs. Collins looked at Margaret, then at Daniel. Your father's biggest enemy wasn't Richard. Daniel waited. It was someone above him. Margaret asked, Who? Mrs. Collins whispered, Your father's employer. Margaret looked stunned. Thomas reported directly to me. No. Mrs. Collins shook her head. He reported to someone who had access to everything. Daniel suddenly understood. Someone inside Whitmore Group. Mrs. Collins nodded. Someone close to Margaret. Margaret's face became serious. Who? Mrs. Collins looked at her. Your former business partner. Margaret froze. Edward. Daniel had never heard the name. Who is Edward? Margaret answered quietly. Edward Whitmore. Daniel looked confused. Your brother? Margaret nodded. He died 15 years ago. Mrs. Collins shook her head. No. Daniel's eyes widened. What do you mean? Mrs. Collins looked directly at him. Edward Whitmore never died. Silence filled the room. Margaret's face went pale. That's impossible. I saw him. When? 3 years ago. Daniel looked at Margaret. Why would your own brother fake his death? Margaret didn't answer. Because she was remembering something. A conversation from 20 years earlier. A warning from Thomas. A name he had refused to explain. Edward. Daniel asked, Was Edward involved in fraud? Margaret nodded slowly. I always suspected it. Mrs. Collins said, He was the person your father was trying to expose. Daniel looked at the old photograph. So Richard wasn't the main villain. No. Then why did he threaten me? Mrs. Collins sighed. Because Richard is still afraid of Edward. Daniel suddenly remembered the wedding. Richard looked frightened when he saw the key. Not angry. Afraid. Margaret stood. We need to find Richard. Daniel nodded. They returned to the reception area. Richard was gone. Daniel's heart sank. Where is he? A waiter approached. Mr. Hale left about 20 minutes ago. Daniel looked at Margaret. Did he say where? No. Then Daniel's phone rang. A known number. He answered. Hello. A man's voice replied. Daniel Carter. Who is this? You have your father's key. Daniel's entire body became still. Who are you? The man laughed softly. Someone who knew your father better than you ever did. Daniel looked at Margaret. She immediately understood. Where's my daughter? The voice became colder. She's safe. Daniel's heart stopped. How do you know about her? Because your father made sure she would be protected. Daniel clenched his fist. Where is she? The voice continued. You're asking the wrong question. Then what's the right one? Why did your father choose you? Daniel was silent. The man continued. Your father knew you would never chase money. Daniel listened. That's why he trusted you with the key. Daniel asked, What do you want? Nothing. Then why contact me? Because there is one final document. What document? The document proving your father's innocence. Daniel's eyes widened. Where is it? At the place where your father first met your mother. The call ended. Daniel looked at Margaret. Did you hear that? Yes. Where did my father meet my mother? Margaret thought. Then her eyes widened. The Whitmore Charity Office. Daniel frowned. I thought they met at university. Margaret shook her head. That's what everyone believed. Daniel stared at her. Why would my father lie about that? Margaret looked towards the wedding guests. Because your mother was working undercover. Daniel's face went pale. His entire family history had been built on a lie. His parents hadn't simply met by chance. They had been connected to the same investigation. And Lily's existence might have been part of the reason Thomas kept the truth hidden. Daniel turned to Margaret. We need that document. Margaret nodded. But there's something more important. What? Your father didn't leave the evidence for me. Daniel understood. He left it for me? Exactly. Daniel took the black key from his pocket. For the first time, he noticed a tiny engraving on it. A letter. L. Daniel looked at Margaret. Lily. Margaret's expression changed. The key wasn't connected only to Thomas. It was connected to Daniel's daughter. Daniel suddenly remembered the message. If they ever come looking for my granddaughter, don't let her go. The words made sense now. Thomas hadn't been talking about money. He had been protecting a family secret that continued into the next generation. Daniel immediately called Emma. Is Lily with you? Yes. Don't let her leave. What happened? I'll explain later. Daniel looked at Margaret, then towards the wedding venue. There was still one final person they needed to find, Edward Whitmore. But before they could leave, a man appeared at the doorway. It was Richard. He looked exhausted. He walked directly towards Daniel. I know where Edward is. Daniel stared at him. Where? Richard looked around. Not here. Margaret stepped forward. Why should we trust you? Richard answered, Because I spent 20 years trying to stop him. Daniel asked, Why did you threaten me? I didn't. You told me some things were better forgotten. Richard shook his head. I was warning you. About Edward? Yes. Richard took a breath. Edward knows about Lily. Daniel's expression hardened. What does he want? Richard looked at the black key. He wants what your father left behind. Daniel asked, What? Richard looked directly into his eyes. The original ownership document. Daniel frowned. Ownership of what? Richard replied, The company. Margaret froze. What? Richard nodded. Your father discovered that someone had secretly transferred control of a major part of Whitmore Group. Margaret stared at him. That's impossible. Not anymore. Richard looked at Daniel. Your father proved the transfer was illegal. Daniel finally understood the real reason behind everything. The fraud, the missing documents, the threats, the 20-year silence. It wasn't about money alone. It was about control. And Thomas Carter had left the evidence with his son. Richard reached into his coat. He pulled out another envelope. This was given to me by your father. Daniel took it. Why are you giving it to me now? Richard looked towards Margaret. Because your father told me to wait until Margaret met you. Margaret looked shocked. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was one final letter. He unfolded it. His father's handwriting appeared again. Daniel, if you are reading this, you are finally old enough to know the truth. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He continued reading. I didn't leave you wealth. He paused. I left you the truth. Daniel looked at Margaret. Then he read the final line. And if anyone tells you that I failed to protect our family, remember this, I succeeded. Daniel lowered the letter. He didn't understand. Not yet. Then Margaret noticed something written on the back. A name. Not Edward. Not Richard. Not his mother. Daniel's own surname. Carter. Margaret whispered. Daniel. He turned the paper over. The final secret was revealed. Thomas Carter had not simply been investigating Whitmore Group. He had secretly owned a controlling share of it. And after his death, that ownership had legally passed Daniel. Daniel stared at Margaret. I'm a shareholder? Margaret nodded slowly. Not just a shareholder. She looked at the document. You're majority owner. Daniel couldn't speak. The single father who had been sitting alone at a wedding that afternoon had just discovered that the ordinary life he had built was connected to one of Britain's most powerful companies. But he wasn't interested in becoming a billionaire. He thought about Lily. He thought about his father. Then he said the one thing nobody expected. I don't want the company. Margaret smiled. Your father knew you would say that. Daniel looked at her. What did he want me to do? Margaret handed him the final page. Daniel read it. Thomas had written, don't become like them. Change what they build. Daniel looked towards Margaret. For the first time, she smiled without sadness. You were never meant to inherit a fortune. Daniel nodded. You were meant to decide what happens to it. Outside, the wedding continued. People were dancing. Children were playing across the lawn. The afternoon sun was shining. Daniel thought about how the day had started. He had arrived alone. He had expected nothing. He had expected to sit quietly, congratulate Sophie, and return home to Lily. Instead, he had discovered his father's greatest secret. He had discovered the truth about his mother's death. He had uncovered a 20-year conspiracy, and he had learned that the billionaire woman who walked towards him wasn't looking for a business partner. She was looking for the son of the man who once saved her company. Margaret placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your father was right about you. Daniel smiled. What did he say? Margaret looked toward the garden. He said you would never choose money over people. Daniel thought of Lily. He was right. Then Daniel looked at the company document one final time. He knew what he would do. He would not become another billionaire sitting behind a desk. He would use what his father had left him to protect ordinary families. He would make sure employees were treated fairly. He would establish a foundation in his father's name. And most importantly, he would give Lily the childhood he had always wanted for her. As Daniel walked back into the wedding reception, Sophie approached him. Everything all right? Daniel smiled, for the first time in a long time. Sophie looked at Margaret, then at Daniel. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Daniel laughed. Maybe one day. Sophie smiled. You've changed. Daniel looked around the room. I think I finally understand something. What? Being alone doesn't mean you're forgotten. Margaret heard him. She smiled, because she knew exactly what Daniel had finally discovered. His father had spent his life protecting his family. Margaret had spent 20 years protecting the truth. And now Daniel had inherited both responsibilities. But he also had something neither of them had possessed. A daughter who reminded him every day what truly mattered. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned home. Lily ran towards him. Dad. He lifted her into his arms. How was your day? Good. She looked at him. How was the wedding? Daniel smiled. Interesting. Did you sit alone? Daniel laughed. At first. Lily smiled. See? I told you not to. Daniel hugged her. She didn't know that her father had just inherited a fortune. She didn't know that powerful people had spent decades fighting over his family. And Daniel wasn't going to tell her yet, because some things could wait. For now, he was simply her dad. The same dad who made pancakes. The same dad who helped with homework. The same dad who drove an old estate car. The same dad who believed that being rich meant nothing if you couldn't help the people around you. Daniel looked out the window. The afternoon sun filled the room. For the first time, he felt that his father's story had finally reached its ending. But perhaps it wasn't an ending. Perhaps it was the beginning of something better. Because Thomas Carter had left his son more than money. He had left him a choice. And Daniel chose family. He chose honesty. He chose kindness. And he chose to use a fortune not to become powerful, but to make sure ordinary people never felt powerless again.